This is Talk It Out, the Women's Agenda podcast. Tune in for your weekly download on the latest news, trends and ideas affecting your career or your business. Here's your host, Angela Priestley.
Hello and welcome to the Women's Agenda podcast for another week. I am here in the studio with Georgie Dent, our contributing editor on Women's Agenda. How are you, Georgie?
Very well, thrilled to be here.
And our special surprise guest, a surprise for you at least,
Suzy,
it
was
because
indeed.
we pulled you in at the last minute, Suzy Jacobs, who has so many things that you've done, but at the moment you are currently the host of the Change Room podcast.
I am indeed. It's been a lot of fun and it's great to be here. Just happened to be walking past and I was like, yeah, let's go have a conversation on a...
Suzy, we need to talk about leadership because it's been a bit of a horrible time in Australian politics at the moment, so let's find some good examples. One of the topics for today, we will talk about what good leadership actually looks like in a lot of different contexts and how we can be better leaders perhaps by trying to emulate some of the things that make good leadership. We also want to share a little bit more about a massive survey on sexual harassment that has been released just in the last 24 hours by Shine Lawyers, supported by Now Australia, and Erin Brockovich has been out from the US talking about that. And we'll end the show with a couple of recommendations. So, Georgie, we could spend a lot of time speculating about Australian politics, but as we know, that would be a waste of time because we could have had multiple prime ministers by the time somebody gets a chance to listen to this.
Things are moving very quickly as it stands, and I think even
or not at all,
but by the hour there are different developments. Yes. Particularly yesterday, I mean, I stepped away from Twitter briefly and came back, and wow. All this is happening. So, change is definitely afoot, but I agree with you that a more positive conversation we can have about this is, what is positive leadership? Because I think the overwhelming sense that I have myself, but also that I'm picking up that other people have about what's happening in Canberra, is what it represents. That we have basically had a decade where there's been, I would say, a leadership vacuum in Canberra, because we've had individuals that are so entrenched in sort of personality conflicts and power struggles that we're not. To me, I would rather have politicians sort of challenge themselves for the leadership over big ideas. Yeah, and sort of have the strength of their convictions to stand up and say, this is what I believe in. If you don't believe in it, I'm not the leader for you, and to go from there. But we haven't actually seen that. And when I stop and reflect on people who I think are strong leaders, it's people who have the convictions and they are authentic and they are willing to be bold and stand up for what they believe in.
I would say there's one word for leadership in Australia at the moment: disappointing.
Absolutely.
I think they've all been disappointing over the past 10 years because for exactly that reason, is that what you hope for is that someone's going to stand up and represent something. Give us a philosophical standpoint, viewpoint, something that we can latch onto and that you will hold on to. And whether you like him or not, and rated him or he was your side of politics or not. But John Howard, for all his good and bad points, he stuck to something. He believed in something and he fought for it.
Yeah, and he was there for a decade.
That's exactly right. And what we've had over the past 10 years is, personality politics. And I couldn't tell you what any of them actually believe in. They're just willing to go with whichever way the tide is turning.
Yeah. And I mean, someone like Turnbull, I think, I think disappointment would be the exact word that a lot of people have for him, because there was a lot of hope around that, particularly his views on climate change, not even that long ago, a few years ago. But I think that if he'd stood by his convictions, and perhaps if he went, okay, well, maybe I can't do this in politics, but I could probably do more for this cause and this issue in the business world than like being part of this stranglehold of what's going on around energy policy.
And that goes to Georgie's point about sort of standing for something, even if you say, actually, call it out and be authentic. Yes, I can do this in business, and I think that he has proven himself to be a strong leader in business. But not all skills are transferable. And here's a perfect example that he's gone into politics and it hasn't worked. Do stuff that you're good at in life,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But look, I think what's really complicated, and I was thinking about this as I've been watching a lot of the coverage, and this has obviously been said before, there was so much hope, I think, when Malcolm Turnbull challenged Tony Abbott and was successful, because we did know from his dealings at that point that he was sort of a bigger thinker, and he did have quite progressive views in a lot of ways, and that I think that I certainly shared some optimism that we were going to enter a sort of more sophisticated period of politics, which would be necessary given all of the challenges that we're facing. Obviously, because of Tony Abbott and the sort of conservative faction, there was always going to be a portion of the Liberal Party that weren't going to accept Malcolm Turnbull. And that's something that he can't have changed. But in my view, what he could have done differently is sort of say, right, well, there's that. I can either take it on and win, or I can walk away. Because I think he's tried to appease them. Appeasement hasn't worked, obviously. And then instead of him actually standing up for anything at the cost, he hasn't. So it's sort of been this lose-lose, because we haven't had, I would personally still have a lot of admiration for a politician who sort of said, this is where I am. If you don't like it, I'm going.
So does that go as far as Trump?
Well, no, because again, with Trump, I would say that there's very little conviction there. I think he changes his position almost more frequently than Australian politicians do.
But he just does it with so much force that nobody people do challenge him, but he still stays on target because he is doing something different. And I think it's just an interesting point, because what I see across the world is that we have sort of a political vacuum that's been created by nobody taking strong philosophical standpoints. So, what you get in that vacuum is extremist views. So you get Trump.
Which suggests a very dangerous period, which I think that we're actually in.
It does indeed. So what's the stranglehold in Australian politics that someone like Turnbull, who isn't a twit, what's happening on the other side that he's not able to navigate that, and nobody seems to be able to navigate it to actually make it a far more workable political system.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, you're certainly right in that Donald Trump is hardline. There's nothing, I've never seen him kowtow on anything. Anyone he doesn't like, anything he doesn't like, he fires them or tweets about how miserable and sad and bad they are.
And he lets you know.
He does. Yeah. There certainly is that. But I would say there has been little consistency in his positions. But he does. He's not afraid to take no prisoners, which I don't think we've had.
Yeah, and people are following him now. Whether they're the people that you would want following you, that's a whole other.
People now are looking at ways to emulate what he's done, which is
well. See, I think that's the thing when you look at Peter Dutton, and even obviously, I think someone else tweeted this morning, but basically all of his radio interviews, he may as well have the t-shirts printed, Dutton for PM. It's clearly what he's after. But even just the sort of brief platform that we're being given from him about cutting immigration, it strikes me as being
playing to the masses.
Playing to Trump's playbook. Obviously for the Liberal Party, One Nation have captured a lot of their votes, particularly in Queensland. And I see his rhetoric, his early rhetoric, and think, I know exactly where he's going to go with this, and it might catch on.
And we saw that also with a certain senator recently. And we don't need to name him anymore because it was I'm going to be out there as controversial as I can be in the hope that maybe I can score. They don't need to score a big portion of the vote, particularly in the Senate. You don't need a huge portion. If you can get like that small portion, if you can appeal to a small group of people, to that minority, then it's a win-win, and all of a sudden you have a seat in the Australian Parliament. I wanted to mention a couple of good examples, who I perceive as being good examples at the moment, and one of it comes through it's really people who stand by their convictions, and I think we're seeing this in Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and I've written about this today because it just what she's doing in the last couple of weeks just marks such a contrast to what we're getting in Australia right now. And I know that New Zealand has a very different political system. It's arguably a little bit easier to get things through there than it is here, but she's just put a freeze on the salaries of New Zealand politicians for a year. And she's done that saying, hey, we earn too much anyway. We don't need to earn any more. And she's got quite widespread support for that. And she's done that in solidarity with nurses and teachers who are currently calling for pay increases in New Zealand. She's pushing for New Zealand, continuing to push for a resettlement option for refugees on Nauru. And in many ways sidestepping Australia on that and trying to find a way to make that happen despite obviously coming up against walls with Dutton. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, and I love this one, she put a ban on single-use plastic bags, and there's little initiatives like that. I think, imagine Australian Prime Minister doing that.
But she also introduced the 10 days of paid leave for domestic violence victims.
She did, yep.
So a
lot of this has been since she returned from parental leave as well, so she's been productive.
And I think it's worth noting
her tolerance is lower as well. She's got less sleep, so she's just, take no prisoners, I'm just going in strong.
It could be that new mum thing where you've just got to get shit done very, very quickly. Because
I also think it's worth noting that, when she won, it's not as if she won with this overwhelming majority of Parliament. So it's not as if you can sort of say she's had carte blanche to do what she likes, but she has been effective, and you have to think, well, how's that happening? Is it because she's collaborative?
So has she had pushback is my question. I mean, I've been off the grid for the past 2 weeks, so I don't really know what's going on in the world, but is it collaboration that she's good at? Because surely she's had pushback on some of this stuff.
I think it is collaboration and charisma. I think people take to her, and I think that's why she won in the first place, because a few months before that election she wasn't expected to win, but she has
people barely knew her name.
A gravitas with people that
she does.
And I also think this has come up a little bit recently, and I mean, obviously I'm open to the fact that there are definitely criticisms of Julia Gillard from her time in as the Prime Minister, but when you look at the record of legislation that she got through in a hung Parliament, again, and I think when you speak to people who were
to shame,
when you talk to the people that were involved at that point, she was really good at negotiating and collaborating with other people, and that's how they got legislation through. And so I have little time and sympathy at the moment when I hear Malcolm Turnbull say, because he's got an easier passage through Parliament than she had, and he has struggled. And I think, I don't think you can discount the power of sort of collaboration, but also being a leader and being able to actually, because being a leader, you need to be able to take people with you.
Julia Gillard didn't come across, in my view, as someone who collaborated. Maybe she did, but that wasn't the sense I had, and she definitely doesn't have charisma.
She does.
If we're looking at
in person, she does.
She
so
does.
It's not transferable.
No, I think with her, I've never sort of experienced such a disconnect. When I met her for the first time, she spoke at our Leadership Awards in 2014,
3 years,
I believe.
Yeah. Or maybe 2015, I can't remember, but she did.
Yeah,
she
did
was
speak. She spoke at our awards, and
some years ago.
She spoke for about 45 minutes, and she was honestly so funny and so warm and so clever, and everyone who spoke to her sort of came away saying the same thing. Even hardline Liberal supporters who were there, I spoke to, and they just said that was not what I expected. And
she gave a selfie to everyone.
You heard that from Canberra at the time, that the people who knew her said the public image and the persona was very different to the person that she was.
I remember that's what we took away, because even meeting her before the event, and she kind of came in the back door, and that was I think warm is just the word that really
that is so surprises me, because I would not.
And she does have that charisma, and I've seen that in other politicians as well when I've met them in person or seen them in person. That does not translate onto the screen, but they do have this aura about them, because they have to get to that point. There has to be. I mean, I don't know about someone like Peter Dutton, who doesn't seem to have any charisma at all, but at some point, just to get there in the first place, to get through the party system, there has to be something that...
Well, I think that as you are like pulling out what makes great leadership, it doesn't have to be every one of those aspects in every person. So there are people who are great orators, or there are people who have just great ideas. I mean, I can't say, again, we're using John Howard, doesn't have much charisma. Secretly, quietly, possibly. But he had, that determination. So it's not that you have to have all
I
those.
guess it might go to that thing, and maybe it is about having a certain. There's a menu. The more items you have, the better. And
I was also thinking, obviously, Ange, you and I were speaking earlier today about what makes good leadership and what examples there are of that. And obviously Jacinda Ardern is one. I also was thinking about the Victorian Liberal government. Now, I know there's definitely Labor government. You can definitely make criticisms of them. But I think one issue that they have been dogged about is gender equality.
Yep.
And so they have had things like the Victorian government boards now have got a majority of women sitting on them, purely because a few years ago they introduced a quota to mandate that to happen. They've taken extraordinary action in terms of domestic violence, in investigating the causes and putting resources into responding to it.
And something like $500 million or something that's gone into domestic, which just compared to what's happening federally just puts it to shame.
Yeah, and the thing that I would say seems apparent is that from across the board down there's a number of people who are obviously really interested in pursuing that. And I think that, again, it comes back to that thing about having convictions. When you want to achieve something and you know what you want to achieve, I think it's a hell of a lot easier to do it. And I think one of the problems I see, with Malcolm Turnbull currently is I actually don't think he knows what he wants to achieve beyond holding on to his job.
Holding on to the job. And maybe it's having the full term, because maybe there's some dignity in having... Maybe that can be a legacy if you at least serve a full term, because I can't see what is going to be his legacy.
Yes, in whose view, though? I mean, nobody else on the outside would say that that's a legacy of any note.
Yeah. Like I said, I think he may have had a stronger legacy sticking with the business community and
but
doing...
you also... Okay, think about this, and this is what is so fascinating at the moment. So think about same-sex marriage. We knew where he personally stood on that issue. Okay, we also knew where all of the polls indicated that the Australian public stood on that issue. To me, if there was ever going to be a really straightforward issue that he could go head-to-head with the Conservative faction of his party, that was going to be a pretty much a no-brainer. Let's do the plebiscite, let's win it, let's make it clear. Even with that, though, he was so cautious around the edges. And it's like, we know you believed in that. We all wanted it.
Yeah.
How much easier do we have to make it? I just thought that if I was the Prime Minister, that would be the first thing I'd do, because it would be such a win.
Yeah.
So you said earlier on, though, that there is so that, to me, that's like bold leadership. I mean, it doesn't seem that bold, but let's put it in that category that's bold. But you said that there's also the issues of what's happening in the party room and all the conflicts and so forth. So is it, and I keep coming back to that, is it such a big issue? Or if he had the real conviction and belief behind what he was doing, you'd be able to negotiate that through and bring people with you, because not every decision you're making as a leader is going to be popular. You have to be able to have those other qualities to be able to take it through to the end. And even if you look in business, and I sit here putting it through that lens, you've got to have a purpose. If you've got no purpose for your business, you're going to go off track without a doubt.
Yeah.
Well, to me, I think the issue is that for whatever reason, he either wasn't capable or wasn't willing to engage with his party room about how to manage that issue. And obviously there was baggage there.
Or maybe he never really had those convictions in the first place, and it was maybe we all read it wrong, and it was all a ploy to appeal to a certain voter base and appeal to a certain level of popularity, progressiveness or something that he didn't actually care all that much about.
And when the pressure's on, the cracks appear. That's in business and in politics. It just always happens.
Yeah.
This is a commercial break for Work It Out. We'll be back in a moment. But if you're interested in being a sponsor for Work It Out or Women's Agenda, just drop us a line and let us know. That's womensagenda.com.au.
So, Suzy, you've just returned from this amazing trip.
I did.
And maybe take us through that. And I don't know if there's any links to this leadership conversation, if you may have learned anything about yourself within that.
Oh, my God, extraordinary. So I just went and a couple of years ago I did my first outback adventure and trekked Larapinta. And so for the next decade I'm going to explore Australia by walking different tracks so I can find out more about this amazing country we live in. I met a ABC journalist by chance who told me you've got to go and walk the Lurujari Trail, which is leaves from Broome and heads 100 kilometres north and just follows the coastline. The Lurujari is sea, means sea, so it's the sea people, it's the Aboriginal community in that part of the world. They've been running this or leading this walk for the past 30 years. So this guy, Daniel Rowe, R-O-E, his great-grandfather first started engaging with the white fella because he recognised if he didn't embrace others in his community, their stories, their culture would not only sort of die out but be trampled upon. There'd be development over it. He had to be able to connect with people. And so for 30 years, they've been taking groups of 30 people on this walk. And as soon as I heard about it, I just knew that's where I'm going to be. So I signed up for it, had no idea what I was in for. And I do think there is something in leadership about this, because there is trust. There is, I had a belief, I had a instinct that I was going to do this walk, and I just did it. And then I gave over all responsibility to the people who were leading me. So this family, and the Rowe family, and when I say family, it's like the young'uns from 2 years of age, the aunts, the uncles, the nieces, nephews, up to Daniel, who's the current elder in that community, take annual leave at this time every year, and they lead this walk. And their conviction in what they were doing, in to continue their great-grandfather's legacy, is extraordinary. And they will point out the tree that he sat under and first had those conversations with academics. In fact, I think at the university in South Australia, because this story has now been written down and in sort of book form, and some of their stories and so forth are in there. They're also fighting native title claims up there at the moment. So there are a whole lot of conflicting pressures on this family, and yet they still manage to stay together and still manage to take people on this walk and share their stories.
And do this every year.
And do this every they do it a couple of times a year. And in fact, I'm going to take a group up there. If any of your listeners are...
I might be.
Yeah. It was extraordinary. So what I learned also from leadership is how important it is to give over to a leader and just and to follow. Doesn't mean unquestioningly. And this was kind of simple stuff. It's just walk in this direction, eat this food, put your tent here, that kind of stuff. But there was a great joy and pleasure and learning from giving over to someone and allowing them to lead you. And through that process, in the first 3 days, I could just feel the baggage dropping off behind me from city, because there's no Wi-Fi, there's no connection to the outside world at all. You are in the most majestic landscape you've ever seen. It is pristine. Australians go off overseas to Fiji, to Vietnam, to whatever. You rock up onto the beaches, there are plastic straws and cups and whatever. Not up there, nothing. It is just pristine. It is absolutely beautiful. So you're walking along these just extraordinary landscape. The baggage of city life is dropping off behind you, and you get real moments of clarity. And as did I, quite simple but profound things about how happy I am just doing this very most basic thing in life, which is just walking and cutting out the noise and allowing myself the time to think, so that I can come back to the city and serve my community and my businesses. And if you talk about leadership in an authentic way, was something which is absolutely comes from my truth about courage and boldness and being true to yourself and creating a life that you love, and all those things which I think are the absolute foundation of who we are as humans, and leading ourselves and then being able to lead political parties or businesses. But that was sort of day 5, day 6, and then there was like this memory of myself as a young person who was so much the adventurer and the outdoors person, and being able to take a moment to go, oh yeah, I'm going to honour more of that when I'm back. And if I do that one thing, that just really keeps me on that true north. That's very much a part of who I am, and so that makes me a better leader when I re-enter this crazy city life. So it was serene, it was simple, it was thought-provoking, it gave me time to reflect, to really come back to my core values and purpose, things we've been talking about in leadership. So an extraordinary experience.
If some of our listeners want to or are interested in learning more about how they might be able to join you next time, what would they do, or is it a little bit too early, or maybe we
too early?
Yeah.
But we can come back and talk about it another time. But if they want to see what it is, it's Lurajari Heritage Trail. Just Google it, you'll find it.
Great.
But I think it's a great thing for leaders. I want to take business leaders, political leaders.
There could be a few with some free
nothing,
time.
That's right, with nothing to do.
They might not be political leaders anymore, but they might be ready for their next challenge.
But I think it's a great process to go through. What happens when you actually have to? You're being led.
Yeah.
How good are you at doing that? It's a great question for them to ask.
Yes.
Themselves.
Wow.
Well, that was a good conversation on leadership.
Really was.
So from leadership, and I feel like this is not the greatest place to go from here, but we do need to talk a little bit about sexual harassment. And we have the results. Georgie, you've done a great piece on this today from a Reach Tell survey on behalf of Shine Lawyers. They've surveyed 3,677 Australian women over the age of 17, and it was only about a week ago. It was done over the course of two nights, so quite a quick survey. They've released the findings with Now Australia, the group started by Tracy Spicer, so they've released it last night. Erin Brockovich was in town.
The Erin Brockovich.
I know, and I'm really sad that I missed this event because I think we've all been huge fans of Erin Brockovich for many years. So she was there to launch it, and she's written an opinion piece for us today, which you can go and check it out. Just search her name on our site if you can't find it. But what were some of the findings of that, Georgie? Or was there anything that came out of it that you found particularly surprising or concerning?
Well, look, I think the number that came out that wasn't surprising was that 20% of respondents had experienced workplace sexual harassment, which is obviously disappointing, but that basically mirrors everything that we've ever heard about it. Of those, it's only about 1 in 5, so again, 20% of that 20% who actually complain. And the primary reasons that women don't complain when they've been harassed is that they fear that the incident isn't bad enough to warrant a formal complaint, that they won't be believed, and that they'll lose their job. And one of the disappointing things that came out was, of those that do make a complaint, 75% of them are disappointed with the outcome because it's either ignored, dismissed, or not handled well. And so they sort of basically regret making the complaint. It's nearly 15% of people who complain who actually resign with no job to go to. And to me, that just goes to the fact that this harassment issue goes to the vulnerability that some women face, because it becomes a financial security issue. If you are being sexually harassed at work, and rather than having that dealt with, because it's too difficult, there's not people listening, you don't have the support, you resign without a job to go to. And so at the event last night, which I wasn't at, but I've spoken to them this morning, and one of the lawyers that was there was sort of saying that, that the message, that the thing that worries him the most, this lawyer in particular, is that individual women are not supported in pursuing these claims, and it leaves them really vulnerable. And one of the things actually that was surprising in this study was that women over the age of 51 were actually slightly more vulnerable to being harassed at work than younger women. I
read that, and I wondered if it was because women over 51 might recognise sexual harassment more than younger women. And I know that's not how it was translated in terms of the report, I don't think, but that was my first instinct, was that is it that they're more vulnerable? I don't know.
Well, that's actually a good question. I hadn't thought about that. But one of the things that one of the lawyers was saying is that he thinks for a lot of older women, they tend to be, and this might not be true, but that they tend to be in a position where they desperately need their job, because whether they are supporting elderly parents, or whether they've got kids at school, or they're trying to meet the varied financial commitments that people always have, that perhaps they're more vulnerable to being harassed because they can't leave.
And I know we saw that in our ambition report that we did a couple of years back, where we surveyed around 2,000 women, and we found that it was women in their early 50s particularly who were saying, I mean, this is not related to sexual harassment, but were saying that they felt they could not get the start in a new organisation that they felt that younger women were able to get. And this is despite the fact that they had all this, that they'd gone and gotten additional education or training or whatever it is, or they felt like they were ready to put the accelerator on their career more than they ever have, because they were out of maybe a zone of having young kids or something, but still they were sensing that they would come up against some form of age discrimination at that time.
Well, I mean, given some of the studies around about age discrimination do confirm that it actually is a really legitimate issue. So for the older women who are actually reluctant to leave their employment for fear of finding another job, unfortunately that fear is actually probably well founded. So one of the things that sort of segues into leadership, I suppose, when Erin Brockovich's piece came through and I was reading it today before we published it, I think she, when I look at it, is quite a strong leader, because as she sort of said, when she was, pursuing the class action that she did, everyone was sort of saying to her, you're not a lawyer, you're not a professor, you're not an environmentalist, who do you think you are to take on this big organisation? And she's, her answer was, I'm a human being. And as a human being, I can see the value, like I can see the damage that's being done, and I can see the value of the lives that are being ruined by this action. And so, you know, she fought, as many of us watched in that terrific film that I actually can't believe was brought out 18 years ago.
Oh, really?
Yes,
oh
I know.
God.
I had to double check that
Okay.
today, but
Yeah.
yeah, it is. It came out in the year 2000.
And she starts with the line in this piece of they're called, what's it?
Yeah,
It's
Ed.
Ed.
They're called
boobs, Ed.
That's
And remember how she
yes.
says that?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
she
yeah,
was
yeah.
asked if she had actually said that. And
Yeah.
she did. And
Yeah.
the whole idea was, hey, let's get the boobs off the table, okay,
Yeah.
so we can move on.
Well, in fact,
Yeah.
as I'm sitting here listening to you guys talk about this, the one thing I would contribute is around language. And I think that, and this is, I was just kind of thinking this, so I'm not saying it's that well thought out, but language, and I still think that when we go to talk about, or I can imagine, when people go to take issues of sexual harassment to their employer, they still feel wrong and that they're in the wrong.
Yes.
And that influences everything from that point onwards. And if you always think you're in the wrong, how do you ever get to a satisfactory point? And so if we can change the language, and it's like, yeah, they're tits, whatever, let's
Yeah.
move on. You're shaking up this, the wrongness, the perceived.
And that is actually the point that Erin Brockovich makes in her piece today. And from looking at some
You
of
can
the
still
tweets
read
from
it,
last
people.
night,
That was one sentence. Still worth
it's
reading.
just that the shame is what keeps people
Correct,
quiet.
yeah.
And as she sort of said, as women, we have been repressed by all of this variety of different reasons that keep us quiet, that make us feel guilty if we do speak up because we're being a troublemaker. When she, you know, she sort of makes the case for the fact that, you know, the fact you got a promotion doesn't mean you're beholden to somebody else. It means you deserved a promotion. And then, therefore, from then on, it's a blank page. It's not as if you have to put up with harassment or discrimination because you're so grateful that you were given a pay rise or you got given that promotion or you have a job in the first place. But I think that shame is so powerful at keeping victims quiet. And I think, unfortunately, there are a number of employers who, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, sort of exploit that shame because I think that it is really easy to, I think it takes a lot of courage for a victim of harassment to actually come forward and speak to their employer. We know that very few people do that. And I think if you have taken that step and do it and the response you get is not, we hear you, we believe you, it will be very easy to shrivel up and walk
That's
away.
right. And again, if you go back to language and you just change the reference point, so it's not that shame, but that takes us being responsible for how we process it as well. I was doing the Australian Institute of Company Directors course last week, and one of the facilitators referred to cognitive diversity. And I love that because it takes it away from sex, race, age, marital status. It's actually what we're looking for is different ways of thinking about the world. That's what we need represented in boardrooms, in politics, everywhere. I love that. And if we can just take away all the dressing, all the skin and bones and clothes and everything, and just actually what we're talking about is our brains and our minds and access that.
Yeah.
The different thoughts that we
Yeah.
bring.
And I do think that collectively there is power in, I think that the number of people that are now speaking out about the instances of sexual harassment, my hope is that the power of that is that more and more of us women can accept, despite all the internal dialogue we might have and any shame we might carry, thinking that it's our problem. I hope we can all move towards a place where we actually, not as a matter of reflex, but we just start to believe, actually, that's not how anyone deserves to be treated. Man or woman, old or young, that's just not how people deserve to be treated.
And I hope we're somewhat on that path at the moment. And I think that, you know, people talk about, you know, does Me Too really matter? But, you know, if it helps one person in working wherever who may never have felt that she could speak up previously but does feel like she can speak up now, then, I mean, that's a win from all of this.
Well, and in the study actually released by Shine Lawyers, it actually says 1 in 6 of the women who complained said that Me Too, because of Me Too, they knew that they were able to make a complaint.
Okay. Wow.
cool.
So
It's
imagine
quite-
what would have been the stat on who complained, you know, this time
Yeah,
a year ago.
I know, it
quite
would
different.
be, yeah, absolutely.
So we should wrap up, and as always we like to wrap up with a recommendation of something that we are doing or listening to or reading. Georgie, I'll go to you first.
Okay, look, mine is I'm on the fence about this, which is a bit terrible when you're making a recommendation, but I've been watching a Netflix series called Bloodline.
Yes, I've seen parts of this.
Have you seen parts of it? Yeah, so the first season I absolutely loved.
Yeah,
I thought it was terrific. And the second season I'm now currently watching thinking, I actually can't watch this because I feel so dreadful for everybody in it because it's just a train wreck. Everybody's lives are being ruined. Yeah. But the first season, I think, and it's got Ben Mendelsohn in it who plays
he's brilliant. He's so good.
The most menacing character. And for him alone, it's worth watching. So you're looking for
menacing.
Netflix. Yeah, I like it.
For me, podcasts are on my radar at the moment. So everyone was talking about Teacher's Pet.
Yes, we've spoken about that in here as well.
I started listening. I'm not such an avid fan as everyone raves about it. So I've got to about episode 4 and I'm going, okay. It's like ticking along. But that's probably the latest one. And of course there's...
You've got your podcast. Podcast. The Change Room.
The Change
Recommend
Room.
that.
The Change Room, which has been great. We're in fact just finished season 2, so we're about to go into season 3, and have had the most remarkable feedback. A community starting to build, and it's actually changing the language. Some of the stuff that we've been talking about in a way that I think is also important to come into politics, into business, and into life. And it's the conversation we have with ourselves and the relationship we have with ourselves. So that's been fun.
The Change Room.
Yeah, The Change Room.
Okay. Well, I've got a podcast as well. I'll recommend that one, first of all. I've heard a few episodes and it sounds great. And there's lots of useful stuff in it as well, which I love. But I want to recommend also, and I don't think I've recommended on this before, but I've certainly taken ideas and things from this that, books and things that I've heard about on this podcast. But Recode Decode by Kara Swisher, who is possibly my favourite journalist over in the US. And it's... when we go back to leadership and conviction, she is such an incredible interviewer. She takes no shit whatsoever. And she's got, go and you can just listen to the Mark Zuckerberg interview that she did from a few weeks back, which is one of the first that he did in a really detailed way with somebody. And all these people in Silicon Valley really, they do trust her because she is so authentic, even though she is so cutting. She tends to have known these sort of big wigs since they were little boys as well. Yeah. So there's no, she's not starstruck by anything. But it's a brilliant podcast. And
what was the name?
Recode Decode. It's from she runs a website called Recode, and she also, I think she's a columnist now for the New York Times, but she was previously of the Washington Post, and so has been a tech journo for a long time. You could probably say
18 years maybe.
Well, yeah, maybe even longer. I don't know what it is, but if you go in and just look at it and you'll find just interesting things there. Often it's just with different authors of business books or different people on leadership sometimes, but often it does have that tech or Silicon Valley slant. So really awesome podcast. And with that, thank you both. Thank you, Georgie. Thank you, Suzy, for the surprise visit.
Pleasure.
It was so wonderful to have you. We'll have to have you back again.
Thanks.
And just a reminder that we do publish Women's Agenda every day just before lunch. You can subscribe for free, and we have loads of great ideas and stories around politics, business, tech, leadership, and much more. Thank you.
That's a wrap for Talk It Out, the Women's Agenda podcast, powered by Eagle Waves Radio. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and jump on the website for more amazing shows. Catch you next time.